Hello and welcome to class 2 of week 11. Today we'll be talking about thought and language, thinking and communicating. I am back at my desk at the Social Attitudes Psychology Laboratory at St. Mary's, and that is because I forgot to hit record in lecture today, so I'm going to have to re-record the first 10 slides or so. Assignment 2 is almost graded. There's one student whose assignment has not been graded yet. As you can see, the grades are very good with an average of 94%. Today we'll talk about thought and language. How do we think? What is language? The textbook takes a basic view of communication, and I think that's appropriate. It's the right place to start. But it takes a basic view that assumes that what is in my head is something that I will forthrightly communicate to you so that it then appears in your head. But in reality, in society, communication involves a lot more than that, and sometimes communication has an instrumental nature. So I'll throw in a little about, say, rhetoric. In pop psychology, we might call that bullshitting and gaslighting. I had been looking forward to a guest lecture on effective writing and presenting from Amanda. Unfortunately, she took ill and was not able to be with us in class today. However, I do want to point out your resources at the Writing Center. The Writing Center does offer many resources to help you with writing and presenting, and you can look them up at the link there or email them at writing.smu.ca. They are located in the Burke Building. Let's start by talking about cognition. Cognition refers to all the mental activities that are associated with thinking, knowing, remembering, and communicating. Cognition covers everything that we're talking about in class today. Metacognition is cognition about cognition, thinking about thinking, what we're doing today. So, how do we think? We think in concepts or ideas. A concept is a mental grouping of similar objects, events, ideas, or people. Consider those 4 objects in the top image. They're all kind of similar. They all have a trunk, and they all have some greenery on top. But they're all a little bit different. There's a fruit tree, there's a conifer tree, but they all share some commonality. There's a trunk, maybe it's about 1 meter high, it has bark on it, and then there's leaves on top. All of these belong to the category of tree. A category is a class or a division of people or things that are regarded as having shared characteristics. So the conifer tree, the fruit tree, the poplar tree, the oak tree are all trees. Let's say I tell you that the quick brown fox jumped over the lazy dog. You all have a basic understanding of that. Perhaps you experience some mental image. Now, we can delve deeper into that. What does quick mean? You're reading that in a particular context. It probably means fast relative to other things in the same category or very similar categories. So it's faster than other foxes, it's faster than that lazy dog, but it isn't quick relative to a fighter jet or the speed of sound or a race car. Okay. So you're interpreting words within their context. Now, what do we mean by brown? What does brown mean? Think of brown right now. Well, can we all agree on that? You can see color palettes here from different artists who take colors very seriously, and this one person is saying brown is that color over there, which the other person might call gingerbread, and this person, or this system's brown, is this other person's chocolate. but they're all pretty similar. There's no blue in there. Now, let's think of the fox. Well, here are the types of foxes, but which one of them is the foxiest fox? When you thought of a fox, which one of those foxes were you thinking of? Now, when I asked this question in class, so far every year, students say that it was the red fox. And I asked them why did they pick that one? And what they say is that it's the fox that comes up in storybooks. And it's the Mozilla Firefox fox. And what that says is that there's an effective frequency. This is the fox that we've seen and known to be a fox. So the foxiest fox is the prototype fox. And for students that I ask these questions to, likely for you, it's the red fox. And that's because it's the fox that you know, the fox that you've seen on the side of the road, the fox that you've seen in your storybooks, the fox that figures in the stories of your culture. So a prototype is a mental image or a preferred example of a category. And matching new items to the prototype provides a quick and easy way to sort items into a category. So you see the marble fox and you think, oh yeah, that's a fox because you're comparing it to the prototype red fox. But if you see the bat-eared fox, you might think that's a raccoon. And you might think that the Sahurin fox is a coyote because they look more like the prototypes of those categories. So category boundaries begin to blur as movement away from the prototype occurs.
So you'll recall from week 1 that psychology is a crossover discipline between philosophy and biology. And does anyone remember who those two guys are? From the history of philosophy? Nobody knows who they are? I'm scandalized. Yes, and Aristotle. And Plato was a thinker who thought about thinking. So he's doing some metacognition. And according to Plato, there was an ideal form of everything. So you've seen many apples, but there's an ideal apple, a prototype apple. Okay? And that form is the eternal or essence or ideal of a thing. So the ideal apple, imagine it in your mind, perfectly and eternally is big and unbitten and unblemished and shiny and red. And maybe it has a bit of a branch and a leaf still attached, and it's the Microsoft clip art apple. You go Google image searching for a clip art of an apple, you get that, but not the kind of blemished one that's got a bite out of it that is more imperfect. Okay, so it's the form of the good apple. And it's like an eternal ideal, and it stands in contrast to and in judgment of the wormy, blemished, sour apples of this mortal plane. Because in Plato's mind, there's a kind of like a heaven-like place where the forms exist. And the form of apple is up there. And what we have down here are particulars of apples, and they're all slightly imperfect. And we can measure their goodness in terms of their approximation to the form of the apple. Okay, but those wormy, blemished, sour apples of the corrupt mortal plane are the bad apples. So here's Plato's theories of forms. You have the particulars, like the apple in your lunch bag, that belong to this plane of the physical world. But then all the apples, all the particular apples, participate in that ideal of the good apple, the Microsoft clip art apple, the form of the apple, the prototype apple. And there's a prototype horse and a prototype rose and a prototype man and a prototype woman. And then Plato would say that the perfect apple, the form of the apple, is a good apple. Okay, and it's the right apple, and it's the true apple. so that all those forms participate in beauty, truth, and justice. Okay? And these forms exist in a perfect eternal world that is outside of space and time, and that's where all the good things are. And he would say that beauty, justice, and truth all share in the form of the good, which is at the top of his pyramid of being. So here's a fun fact for you. About 2,000 years ago, this philosophy called Neoplatonism met a new religion coming out from the East. Okay, maybe a new version of Judaism. And so we came to have the Father, that's truth, and the Son, that's goodness or justice, and the Holy Spirit as beauty, and then those as God. So that's the root of the Trinity. Now, why am I telling you this? Because Western thought has a history of seeing deviation from norms, deviation from a category as kind of corrupt or bad, and conforming to it as a sign of sort of goodness and worth. And maybe you could say that it's not just going back to Plato. Maybe there's, let's say that we're going to do some evolutionary psychology. We could speculate that maybe the forms are the things that we know. We say, yeah, all of the apples that taste good are kind of they're red and shiny, whatever they are, and we feel safe with those. And maybe the other apples that are a bit different, we're like, should I eat that apple? Right? Maybe that apple could make me sick. Could be another argument. But either way, there's something about conformity to a prototype that makes us feel safe and that makes us interpret things more positively. Assigning something to a category influences how we perceive it. So if research participants are shown a face that's 70% white, people will tend to remember the person as like more completely white, and then that when they're asked which face did you see, they're actually going to pick that one because they remember it in terms of the prototype rather than what they actually saw. Okay, so categories influence our perception. Are prototypes sexist? Where sexist means somebody who is prejudiced against someone of a certain gender or sex, is male. People more easily detect and more readily believe in male prejudice against females than in forms of discrimination about sex that don't fit that type. Okay, so that kind of mean girl relational aggression and slut shaming is sexist. We tend not to see it that way. We have a hard time understanding that women can be prejudiced against men, or the men can be prejudiced against men. There's some weird stuff in this was with the second week of class about male answer syndrome that doesn't even exist. Okay, and we struggle with that a bit because those exemplars don't fit the type or the narrative, and so they're harder to accept. So do we have prototypes for people, for who a person is? Right, like what? Let's say if you imagine a person, the form of the person. What does that person look like? What age or gender or race is the prototypical person, and to whom? So maybe to, let's say, middle-class white people in a majority white society, the prototype person is just like that, just like them. But maybe to people in Botswana, the average Joe looks very different and isn't called Joe. So to people, so consider the prototype person with a disability, right? To able-bodied people, you see this symbol a lot. So then how do able-bodied people think about people with disabilities when that's the prototype? Okay, could there be difficulty acknowledging or accommodating people with invisible disabilities, or the ones that are mental rather than physical? They don't fit that prototype as well. And the prototypes of accommodations of just building a ramp that come with that. So psychologists and other social science researchers who are studying discrimination tend to focus on one category, one factor, right, one axis for discrimination. And that's usually gender or race, but the focus would be very narrow on like very few genders or ethnicities. right? It's not all the different ethnicities. It might be just one or two. So the problem with that is that when we succumb to our social prototype of people, and we all have them, so that when we're talking about all women, who are we talking about? Right? What is the race of the prototype of all women? Kimberly Crenshaw argued that it's a white woman. Okay. And she argued that when we talk about employment discrimination against Black people, we tend to be talking about Black men. And yet certain groups have intersecting factors for discrimination, right? So let's say, in this case, Black women, in her argument, would have qualitatively different barriers that are specifically about those experiences. And those experiences aren't addressed or acknowledged by theories, interventions, policies that follow from that single category thinking, that come out of those single axis analyses. Okay, so an intervention for, let's say, women in the workplace, or whatever intervention for women in general, is it assumed, is it designed for white women? And how would, say, Indigenous women experience that? Okay, so then those policies or processes or interventions might ultimately fail to address the needs of multiply disadvantaged employees or people, okay, who may be in greater need. And so that addresses why that statement, all lives matter, is problematic, because who is the prototype life? And one of the best examples I saw of this was, I think it was around 2015, but there was a very tragic video on Facebook, and it was of somebody being beheaded. Do you guys remember this? It caused quite a media storm. Or is this before your time? Before your time? No? Did anyone remember it? Yeah? So there was a video that somebody posted on Facebook of a Mexican woman having her head cut off. And there was a furor about this, and there were some questions about, what are you allowed to put on Facebook? Like, what if children saw this? There's gory content. And there were a lot of media articles about it. And what was really stunning about it was that it was a very long time until one article was by the BBC ever asked who she was. That was a person, that was maybe somebody's mother, somebody's sister, somebody's student. Like, who was she? That was completely absent. It was all about, like, okay, this is gore, and what if our children see gore, and what's the policy, and what can you tell Facebook to do? But there was no sense of empathy for the fact that somebody violently died on that video. And remember when it came out and I was trying to find out who she was, that the most empathy that I could find was actually on those, those gore sites that people go to when they want to know what a motorcycle accident looked like. That's where people were sort of speculating on who she might have been, and that sounds like it could have, or looks like it could have been gang violence. But it was amazing how depersonalizing the coverage was here. And it makes me wonder if that had been a video of a white woman being beheaded, would the reception have been different? Right? Would this be now a video of somebody being murdered, and who was she? And were the perpetrators brought to justice? That question didn't come up at all. There was no question about who was doing this, or why, or what happened to them, and did anyone call the police? Okay, so on to how we solve problems. So there are various methods by which we solve problems, and the most methodical, elaborate, likely to be correct thing is called an algorithm. There's an example here from your textbook. Okay, your lamp doesn't work. Well, check if it's plugged in. Kind of like that guy here was like, is your microphone turned on? And it wasn't. And then, that's the problem. All right, now we've solved it. But if that's not the problem, let's look at the next thing and systematically, next we'll check the batteries, find out what's wrong with it and fix it. That is a good way to solve problems. But in real life, we have a lot of problems coming up at once. And so we tend to use simpler strategies that are speedier. And they work really well overall, and they save us a ton of trouble. And that's why we use them. but they are more error prone. So one of the heuristics that you have is a trust that the things that you read in your psychology textbook are true. Imagine if you didn't have that and you had to fact check every single statement. And every time you saw an in-text citation, you went back and read the primary journal article on it, maybe check their references to see if that really added up. You couldn't do that. You would never finish this class. So it's a good heuristic, it's a good rule of thumb that you can trust the experts that wrote that textbook. However, we do know, because we've already found some, I've already shown you some, that there's some statements in there that are on shakier ground, right? We claimed that a person can remember 5,000 faces. It was fairly shaky. So was 10,000 hours of practice in order to be an expert. So were those exaggerated graphs we looked at. So it was male answer syndrome. And a few students from last year's class got into that and started checking out more things. And they said that they found another 8 issues. But overall, I hope that's a pretty small percentage of what you're reading. It's one of the top 10 textbooks, so I really hope it is. I'd say it probably is. So it's a good heuristic for you to trust your textbooks, your psychology textbook and your biology textbook, but they're not perfect and sometimes they might mislead you a little, okay? They can also lead to bias or discrimination. Let's say you know that there's crime rates are higher in a certain neighborhood, so now you're sort of like clutching your purse while you walk through there. Or what if, actually, let's think about that paragraph from Feldman and Lavoie. They had this idea that you should never leave your drink unattended. Well, it's not a terrible idea. Like maybe if you never left your luggage attended, maybe if you never left your drinks unattended, that would help you stay out of trouble, but it's not a good legal defense for the perpetrator. So you can see where they're coming from, but there are shortcomings, right? They don't consider all the nuances and all the context and all the issues that might be important. But if you're going to do that, you need a lot of time and you're not thinking about other things. Heuristics can, as you know, go wrong. Example is the availability heuristic. We might estimate the likelihood of events based on how available they are to us in memory. So if we hear a news report about a terrible plane crash, we're very aware of that, very afraid of that. Well, then we might think that the likelihood of a plane crash happening to us is far higher than it actually is. And in fact, after September the 11th, there were more sort of traffic-related deaths or transport-related deaths because a lot of people started driving instead of flying, and there are a lot more car accidents. A lot more people die in car accidents than they do in airplane crashes. That can be used to advantage. People were not really connecting with all the stats and data and numbers about the crisis in Syria. It wasn't getting through to people, but that one picture of the little boy changed things. And people finally got it once they saw that. It was as if they were seriously underestimating things, and then a picture, which makes you overestimate things, kind of got people to maybe the right place. And there's the representativeness heuristic. So we might estimate the likelihood of events in terms of how well they seem to represent our prototype or match a stereotype. And we might ignore other information. So let's say people who are looking for a suspect in crime, they might focus disproportionately on men because, let's say, men have higher crime rates. And if it was a woman who did it, it'd take them longer to find her. There are implicit methods for problem solving as well. So you have insight. Sometimes you have a sudden aha moment where you see the solution to a problem. Okay. And then there's intuition. Sometimes you have a gut feeling about something. And that is based on your implicit knowledge, which goes back to your conditioned associations. if you've learned that a certain place or a certain type of person is unsafe, you meet something that goes somewhere similar, meet someone similar, you might kind of have a feeling of discomfort. There are cognitive biases that get us stuck. So we tend to look for information that supports our beliefs. So my mom is strongly anti-vax, and she will believe anything anti-vax that is out there. But if anything comes up that supports vaccination, she's just very skeptical of it. Okay? She kind of wants to believe what she wants to believe. It could be the silliest argument against vaccination, but she'll buy it. Okay? That's confirmation bias. We tend to cling to beliefs and ignore evidence that they're wrong. And then we have tendencies to approach problems the way we have before, to think about them a certain way. That's called a mental set. So if in the past you have fixed your crashed computer by rebooting it, next time it crashes, you're likely to reboot it, even if that isn't the most effective way to fix the problem. But it worked, and you know that, so you'll do it again, and maybe it'll work. So that can lead to something called fixation, that you're fixating on that solution, and it's harder to have a sort of a fresh perspective that could lead to a more efficient solution. And so it does help to talk to other people when you're trying to solve a problem, because they're going to have different experiences and perspectives. And that can help you see a problem from different angles, can help you solve it. Framing sways decisions and judgments. In the unit on social psychology, we talked about, we had that picture of the man on the street from your textbook. And what if we look at this as personal responsibility? It's his fault. How are you going to address the issue? Or what if we look at it as social responsibility? Well, then what are we going to do? So if we made a dispositional attribution, we solve the problem a certain way. If we make a situational attribution to why he's like that, then we try to address the problem a different way. Say a student's missing deadlines. Was that because they're irresponsible, lazy, don't listen, didn't read the syllabus? Well, now what should I do? Let them fail? They deserve it. But what if I tried reframing it? What if you said, this is academic distress? So if you flag a student that's in academic distress, well, then what are you supposed to do? And how do you support them to succeed? See how framing the same problem leads to different solutions. And what ultimately matters is what solution works best. Nudging exploits framing to get people to make a decision we want them to make. A good version of nudging might be to place a salad bar up front in a cafeteria or in the lunch line if you know that people are likely to just eat whatever they encounter first. So you could redesign that cafeteria hall to help people make healthier choices. You know, and maybe go put the ice cream somewhere inconvenient where they don't see it. The evil version of nudge is when they put the sugary junk breakfast cereal on the lower aisles of the grocery store. Then kids see them. And the rule of thumb there is that kids want what they see. They're in appealing boxes. There's seen some ads. They'll whine about it, and then the parents will buy it to appease the kid. And in that case, the child's operant conditioning the parent with negative reinforcement. Buy this and I'll stop complaining. There's another nudge here. I require 24 hours notice for an extension. What is that nudging? Well, that's the rule, but why would I come up with something like that? Enough time to what? No, because I don't tend to not read emails over the weekend, and so it'll be coming in on a Saturday. I won't even see it. Yes. Can you say it louder so I can hear you? It is about that last minute thing. So I'm trying to discourage that kind of last minute scrambling. So if you know that you can't meet the deadline, if you can recognize that 25 hours in advance, that's showing a little bit more foresight and planfulness and awareness of what's going on in your life and what you can and can't manage. So it's a nudge towards greater planfulness. I think that's basically it. We do tend to be overconfident in what we know, more confident than correct. So we tend to overestimate the accuracy of our beliefs or judgments. We think we're right, and we really think we're right. And how many times have you experienced that something that you were sure was true turned out not to be? So all the sort of investment managers you'll meet will tell you that they outperform the stock market. Can they really do that as a group? Most students think their grades are above average. Send out surveys and ask students to indicate whether their academic performance is below average, average, or above average. About 85% say that it's above average. That's not the way normal distributions work, but I will allow that sometimes there are skewed distributions where the mean isn't the same as the median. But the fact that we tend to be overconfident in our abilities is why overlearning works. Okay? We tend to think that we have more time than we really do. So give yourself even more time to get something done, because things are going to come up. A common sort of type of message that I get from students with low grades is that they're very confident that they know the material and they can't understand why they're getting low grades. And they think that maybe there could be a computer glitch, right? They don't understand. And I'll go over the test and it'll be fairly clear that they are struggling to understand the material. And maybe that the study habits are poor. But often they're very sure that they understand everything. They're like, I understood everything. I don't understand how out of 50. So I encounter that fairly frequently. Confidence itself does have adaptive value. So people who seem more confident tend to also report feeling happier. Other people think they are more competent, whether or not they really are. Creativity is our ability to produce new and valuable ideas. And it's about divergent thinking rather than convergent thinking. When you ask a question like, how many ways can you use a fork? Right? There are so many potential right answers to that question, and some of them will be very creative. So divergent thinking is a kind of spontaneous, lateral, free-flowing way of thinking that creates unique ideas, creates multiple solutions, and it keeps options open. There may be no truly one correct answer. And then there's times when we need convergent thinking. So let's say on your quizzes, you know that one of the usually 4 response options is going to be right. And you can narrow it down by crossing off ones that you think are wrong. So in convergent thinking, you narrow the available problem solutions and pick the one best solution. And it's a logical process. It's a bit more like black, white, right, wrong thinking. You'll need both of these kinds of thinkings in your life. Creativity is helped along by expertise. The more you know about something, like if you're an artist and you really know your materials, you really know your clay, and you really know your paints, you're going to be able to be more creative with them. The more you know, the more unique combinations you can come up with. There are imaginative thinking skills. The book mentions venturesome personality, and I think that corresponds to the personality trait of openness. And people who want to be creative often have an intrinsic motivation, an inner motivation to solve some problem. to make something new. And they do best when they're in an environment that supports creativity. Some environments don't. You can think of maybe classroom environments that support creativity, give you a lot of tools, come up with things on your own, versus one where you have to repeat back exactly what was taught, and then it's right or wrong. We make the best decisions when we integrate our explicit and implicit processes, when we integrate our conscious and our unconscious mind. And if you're trying to solve a problem, it can help to give your unconscious mind a chance to work on it. Students do better on tests when they read the whole test first and then come back to answer the questions rather than just answering the questions sequentially. And the reason for that is that you're giving your unconscious mind a chance to work on things, right? Once you've reviewed it, and then start. But if you just start cold, you're not giving your unconscious mind that chance. Sometimes it helps to just not think about a problem for a while. Just take a break for it. You're still working on it somewhere, somehow, and then some insight might come to you later when you're not expecting it. Sleep on it. There's a chapter from Feldman and Lavoie that I didn't assign on decision making. That's because it's the one that came without offensive paragraph. But they suggested a strategy that I thought was quite interesting. Like sometimes you might feel like you don't know what you want and you can't decide. If you flip a coin, say heads means yes, tails mean no, and you feel happy if you get heads, then maybe that's what you really wanted. If you're like, oh shit, maybe that's not what you really wanted. So it's a little strategy to help you listen to yourself. Humans aren't the only animals that think. So other animals that have the neural networks for consciousness. We can't really ask a cat, are you conscious? Describe your consciousness. But in their brain structure that we can observe, they do have the neural networks that we identify with consciousness. Animals use tools. They can use very basic concepts and numbers. Pigeons can do some pretty basic math. They will know what number is lower than another. Right? They can learn. They can remember. They can even teach. They can show insight. So chimpanzees can show self-awareness when they look in a mirror and they have a red dot on their head and they touch it and try to get it off. They know that's them. That's self-awareness. And they can show grief, like elephants. Crows have some interesting sort of funeral customs. Ever seen one of those? And they can sort of teach their young to do things. Okay. So language, which is what we use to communicate our thoughts to each other, refers to spoken, written, or signed words, and the systematic ways that we combine them to communicate meaning. And I would like to distinguish between a couple of concepts. So what do we mean by language? What do we mean by communication? At the very broad level, communication is about exchanging information. So if I look like this, it might communicate to you that I'm sad. And if I smile, I communicate to you that I'm happy. And we might even call that body language. In the unit on social psychology, we talked about the body language of dominance and submission. But, and in your textbook, they also talk about baseball sign language. Now, is body language, just like a lay term, is that language? Meeting that definition? Is baseball sign language language? It's certainly communication, but is it language? Any thoughts? Is body language a language? Yes, I'm seeing nodding. I have to disappoint you. So a language is the kind of thing that you could write a book or tell the story of a book in. You can't do that in body language. Body language is communication. So if I smile, well, that means something. And maybe it means that I'm happy. Maybe it means that I'm submissive and appeasing you. Maybe it's some kind of grimace from pain. There's this ambiguity. But if I say the ball is red, there is no ambiguity, or dramatically less ambiguity in what I mean by that. We all know what a ball is. We all know what red is. We could argue about shades of red, but that is far more explicit than body language. And language also, real language also requires words. Okay, so words that we agree have a meaning, words that we can put in a dictionary. Language also have systematic ways of combining the words. So if the words in your textbook were ordered randomly, like there's the same words, but now they're in random order, you can't understand it anymore because there's no grammar anymore. We have certain ways of using words that say this happened in the past, this is happening now, or this will or could happen in the future. That's grammar, and there are rules that we understand that way. So language has rules, ways of ordering words like syntax and grammar. So, do other animals have language? What about that cat that's meowing at you? Is that cat language? Yes or no for language? Seeing a no. Why is that not language? Yeah, I hear what you're getting at. It's vocalizing a feeling. Meow is a feeling. And you can understand because of the tone of the meow and because of the cat sitting next to the dish and because it's a certain time of the day that it wants to be fed. So it's communicating its hunger to you and its desire and expectation that you feed it. It's communicating, but it's not language. So humans are the only species that possess language. Though animals do have a wide range of comprehension and communication, there are some words that your dog can understand, like sit, right? That's not the same thing as having language. Chimps can learn simple sign language, and sign language is a true language with grammar and syntax and all that, but it's a visual language that's based on hand movements and facial expressions. So the picture there is of a research chimpanzee named Washoe, and she was taught sign language. And she bonded with a volunteer research assistant named Kay. And Kay would come visit her every day, and they'd have loads of fun. And Kay was pregnant. And one day, Kay suddenly stopped coming to visit. And Washoe was upset about this. And when she came back, Washoe gave her the cold shoulder, like in those attachment studies. Okay. And using this simple sign language, Kay was able to explain that she lost the baby. And Washoe signed like this, which means cry. And until that point, researchers thought that chimps didn't have empathy. And she taught some of these signs to her adopted son, whose name was Lulis. So your textbook, I won't spend too much time on this, explains structures of language. Like the smallest distinctive sound is like a vowel sound or a consonant sound, like ah or th. Those are phonemes. When we're very young, like babies, we can hear them all. We can produce them all. But over time, and it's not very much time, we lose the ability to do that. So I've never learned Vietnamese. It wasn't spoken in my home. People who speak Vietnamese make sounds that I can't hear, that I wouldn't be able to produce because I can't hear them. Okay. Then a morpheme is the smallest unit that carries meaning. So in the word readers, read is kind of the verb of what you're doing. Read, the ER tells you there's people who are doing it. And then the S is the meaning that there are several of these people who are doing reading. So that has 3 morphemes. Then grammar is that system of rules that enables us to communicate. Okay, you need to order them in a way that makes sense. Okay, and then we also derive meaning from sound. So if I say, let's eat, Grandpa, that means something different from let's eat, Grandpa. And that's just in kind of the cadence of how I said those words. So we have receptive and productive language, and they correspond with different brain areas. And infants start with receptive language. They start by being able to understand what is said to them. And then they also have productive language. They start kind of babbling, okay? And the babbling develops into language. So around 10 months, I might say, mama. And by 12 months, they're at one word, kitty. And then at around 2 years, they have what is called telegraphic speech. So 2 words like grandma buy, give that. And then around not too long after that, there's rapid development into complete sentences. There's like over 6,000 languages in the world, and they all sound very different. But underneath it all, there actually is a shared universal grammar. And Noam Chomsky theorized that humans are born with a predisposition to learn grammar rules. And there's a wonderful example with Nicaraguan sign languages. So once upon a time, not very long ago in Nicaragua, there were no schools for the deaf. Deaf children, most of whom are born to hearing parents, would have some home signs with their families. So maybe if you're a hearing person, you have a deaf child, you can communicate, this means yes, and that means no, and those would be the home signs. And some of them are probably pretty similar between homes. Like maybe there's a lot of homes where this means good, and that means bad, right? And that means no. So what happened is that at some point, the government decided, let's bring all these children into a school for the deaf, and they'll learn American Sign Language from their instructors. But that's not what happened. So the students started signing in ways that they could understand, and the instructors didn't even know what was going on. And what had happened is that the kids were using their home signs with each other and figuring things out and making new ones. And it turned into a pigeon. And no, I did not say pigeon. I said pigeon. And pigeon is something like, say, Creole, and it's a grammatically simplified form of language. And it's used for communication between people who don't share a common language, but they're starting to get at common meanings, and they're bringing them together with elements from various different, say, local languages. Okay, and then more arises out of that contact. And so the younger children developed the early pidgin language of the older children, And then it turned into a fully fledged language with its grammar and its syntax. And psychologists like to study this because it's the only case of a complete language developed, right, in a period where the originators of the language are still alive. And so the point of all this is to say that language development is inborn in humans, just like cats chasing laser pointers. And another thing you'll hear about is sometimes twins come up with their own language, like private language just to themselves. Infants start without language, and you move through these stages of babbling, of one words, two words, and then, telegraphic speech is, it's more than just two words, right? It's more like me thirsty, give juice, and we keep talking like that. And then by elementary school, we have complex sentences. Children learn grammar as they hear sort of statistical patterns in the language that they hear. Babies learn to discern the breaks between words. It can be really, if you're listening to a language and you don't know that language at all, you don't know where one word starts and another word ends. It all flows together. When you're learning a language, you'll learn to parse it out. There are critical periods for language development. We know that kids who are very tragically raised by wolves may never learn language, ever, past the critical period, and might be something like 7 years old. Now, it's harder to learn a new language as an adult, and it's harder to master the grammar, and it's also harder to learn sort of the accent. However, that doesn't mean that that one shouldn't do it. You shouldn't go learn another language as an adult. Like, there are many cognitive benefits to bilingualism. Like, it's good for your brain. And people who learn a language later in life will always have an accent. And I have a lot of respect for people who learn additional languages as adults. It's not easy. And when teaching English as an additional language, the instructors tend to not correct grammar and not correct pronunciation unless you really can't understand what they're saying. Like, unless the way they're pronouncing the word is making it sound like a new different word and it's changing the meaning of the sentence, right? Then you'd intervene. I remember a lot of laughter when some of our students couldn't hear the difference between like beach and bitch, the sound of the E and the I. If you're interested in this, there actually is a wonderful program at the Halifax Public Library that's associated with the Nova Scotia Office of Immigration. And you get to, as a native speaker, converse with and therefore naturally teach newcomers. It's important for children, for deaf children who are born to hearing parents, and that's like 90% of them, to have early intervention for language development. Sometimes people don't know that a baby is deaf, right? Sometimes they think there's some other cognitive issues. Sometimes it can be identified like fairly late. Most hearing parents who have a deaf child want to get a cochlear implant. That is controversial in the deaf community. So often deaf parents who have a deaf child might not want that. And that kind of goes back to culture and communities. So the National Association of the Deaf would say deafness is not a disability, right? They're not linguistically disabled if they natively speak sign language. There are different parts of your brain that process your productive speech and your productive language and receptive language. So it's possible to have a stroke or a brain injury such that you can still understand other people speaking to you, but not be able to speak back to them. Okay. And the brain does use parallel processing when processing language in multiple areas of the brain. So when you're speaking words, that engages Broca's area and your motor cortex because of everything you're doing with your lips and your tongue and your vocal cords. When you're hearing words, using what's known as Wernicke's area and your auditory cortex, because you have to make sense of what you're hearing. And if you're reading words, then it uses a part of your brain, I think it's the angular gyrus, it's in your visual cortex. and then sends that information back to the auditory cortex. And now you're hearing what you read. There's an interesting phenomenon where people who've lost their ability to speak can still sing. I don't know if they can only sing songs they already know or whether they can sing anything they want, like have a conversation song. I don't know how far that goes. But that is because singing uses different parts of your brain than speaking like this. If you're interested in literacy, we didn't really cover reading very much. We do have a professor here, Nicole Conrad, who's actually our department chair, who studies literacy in children. Now let's try to connect language and thinking, the two major topics for today. Linguistic determinism would say that all your ideas, all your thoughts are based on your language. He would say that if there were a culture where they didn't have color words, then they can't see those colors. Let's say there's a culture where they only have words for black, white, and gray. And someone was able to disprove this theory by finding such a culture, and no, they had completely normal color vision. It just didn't matter to them as much. However, words do influence our thinking. So it's not a completely deterministic relationship, but they do have an influence. There's evidence from bilingual speakers that people think differently in different languages. Okay. And trying to remember where that example came from, but if you use different words to describe a color, you would maybe see it as more blue.
Sometimes it happens that even right in the middle of a lecture, the lecturer will forget what they're talking about and what they're supposed to be saying. And you just saw that happen to me. Let's go back to that figure of the colors now that I do know what I'm talking about. So what you see there are 6 squares colored between green and blue. On the ends, there's an unambiguous green, and at the other end, there is an unambiguous blue. And in between, there are shades that we might call aquamarine or teal or turquoise. And some people will look at a turquoise shade and say that's green. And some will say that's blue. And sometimes they have arguments about it. Now, let's say that you looked at the 3rd square and you called that green. But if you looked at the 4th square, you called that blue. It's crossed the threshold for blueness. And now let's look at the next one. And we'll say that that one, well, it's even bluer, so it's definitely blue. So we're calling the 3rd square green and the 4th square blue, and we're also calling the 5th square blue. The 3rd and 4th squares are just as different from each other in terms of blueness as are the 4th and 5th. However, if you put the 3rd one in the green category and call it green, and you put the 4th one in the blue category and call that blue, you'll perceive the difference between those two colors, which are now in different categories. And remember that category assignments affect our perception. Well, you'll see them as more different than square 4 and square 5, even though the difference between 4 and 5 is the same as the difference in color between 3 and 4. I hope that was a better explanation.
Okay, so this text teaches us about basic communication, which is the idea that, let's say, in my head, I see a red ball, and I say, a red ball. Parts of my brain make my mouth move. I say those words. They come to you, to your ear through the sound waves. Comes into your ear. What is going on there? And it's processed in your brain. And now you see a red ball in your mind's eyes. And that's a great place to start. Okay. So, but it assumes that when people communicate, it's very directly, it's very forthrightly, it's in good faith. But in reality, communication is much more than that, right? Sometimes it's very, say, symbolic. Sometimes people say yes when they mean no, right? Sometimes it's rhetorical. And communication is often about persuasion. So it's getting you to do something, right? It's about telling you a narrative that informs your next action. I have a question for you, because it's a word I hear a lot, and I want to know what it means. So what is bullshit? What do you mean when you say that word? Am I doing it to you now? What does that mean? Depends on the situation. Okay. People use it as a bit of an expletive. That's... Okay. They're like problems that I don't really care about, that I don't really have time for. So it's a term of disparagement.
Yeah. And then this bullshit is more just like something that
Okay. Yeah, so it's kind of something of low value. Like you don't really care about that. You don't want to hear that story. So there's not fair. Interesting. Why is it not fair? So is the bullshitter telling you the truth? Yes.
It's just something, it's like the truth that you just don't want to accept.
So it could be like, is it partly true, not true? So it could be true. How is bullshit different from a lie? Like if I was to tell you a lie, this is a sociology class, that's a lie. The liar knows the truth and respects the truth. Like if I tell you a lie, like this is a sociology class, well, I know the truth, I'm just telling you something else. In the philosophy of truth, bullshit is when people communicate without a particular concern for the truth. So maybe some of the things they say are true, and some of them are exaggerations or spin, and some of them are lies, but truth isn't really the point. It's truthiness. It's what they're trying to get you to do. They're trying to get you to do something. When my cousin came to Canada after the fall of communism in Eastern Europe, she was really excited by these advertisements for Pantene Pro V that she was seeing on TV. And she believed them. She thought that this was like literally true, that you will wash your hair with Pantene Pro V. And when you dry it with a towel, it will come out like that. And we couldn't tell her. And it was kind of tragic because she went and used it. And well, you know, it's partly true that it'll make your hair cleaner. It's kind of true that it'll make your hair a bit shinier compared to not washing it. But this is bullshit. Like there's an element of truth there. That's clean hair. Maybe they used it in the ad. But there's also a hot iron involved in there, right? There's also probably a lot of hairspray. She also has unnaturally gorgeous hair. Actually, maybe it's a wig. Kind of, it doesn't matter if it's true. It's partly true, it's not true, it's exaggeration. It's just about getting you to buy it. Okay, so there's less concern for the truth. And a lot of communication is instrumental. It's about getting you to do something. The cigarette company doesn't care if this guy gets a girlfriend or not. And blowing smoke in a woman's face is not a good strategy. They're just trying to sell them the cigarettes. I think that's what they want to do. Okay. Have you heard the term gaslighting? Anyone know what gaslighting is? I've heard people using it in the hallways. Gaslighting happens when there's a power relationship. And this is pop psychology, not scientific psychology, but a lot of useful things come out of pop psychology. So a gaslighter has the power and the dominant person decides what's true. So let's say that I'm your boss and I say, you came in late yesterday. You're like, no, I didn't. Yes, you did. I have it right here in my records. And sometimes people do that just because they need that to be true for their own reasons. And your experience and what really happened doesn't matter to them. And for somebody who's on the other side of a gaslighting relationship, it makes them feel like they're crazy. Because if they have that sense of trust and they believe that what that other person is saying is true and not just self-serving and instrumental, they start questioning their reality. They're like, what happened? Like, was I actually late? Did I really say that? Right? Because like what happened didn't happen. What didn't happen did happen. So sometimes people who have power can just say, that didn't happen. I never said that. Yes, you did that. And if you know it's gaslighting, you can be like, okay, they're gaslighting. But if you don't know that, it can have a really damaging effect on people. Like people sometimes will even start keeping records, writing down what happened. They'll be taping to prove to themselves that they're not actually sort of crazy. And the term gaslighting is based on a movie called Gaslight, where it kind of messes with her head. So he's upstairs doing something in the attic that he shouldn't be doing. It makes the lights kind of go up and down. And she'll be like, are the lights going up and down? He'd be like, no, they're not. You're not well. And then there's a servant who's kind of in on it. He's like, no, I didn't see anything change. And then she really sort of starts to think she's crazy. So hopefully you don't end up in a relationship like that. Buzzwords. These represent values. Sometimes they don't have much meaning. This is the corporate BS generator. It's online. And it just randomly pulls, following a syntax, following a structure, an adverb that sounds like it has positive corporate values, and then a verb that sounds like it has positive or desirable corporate values, plus an adjective, plus a noun, and it spits out a sentence that's randomly generated. But it sort of sounds good. I got collaboratively network empowered communities. You could pull up another one, like, what do you want to do in 5 years? Well, I want to professionally empower team building interfaces. And these words represent values and strung together into a sentence, they sound good. In 1983, Pacific Bell put about 60,000 employees through a $30 million a year sort of leadership development training program. It was called Croning. And it was about teaching people to rethink the way they think to arrive at new solutions. And it's based on the idea that certain words help employees communicate better, and this will lead to better organizational health. Isn't that a great idea? What they did was define a lot of words, and you're only allowed to use words in the ways that were prescribed. So the definition of interaction is, this is from their HR manual, the continuous ability to engage with the connectedness and the relatedness that exists and potentially exists, which is essential for the creations necessary to maintain and enhance viability of ourselves and the organization of which we are a part. I tried to look up their psychological model for how this works, and it does make a pretty star shape. So good teams have uniqueness, and they have required nourishment, and a sense of their maximum potential. Are you impressed with that theory? Employees weren't. There were hundreds of complaints, and they alleged mind control and thought policing. This was investigated by the California Public Utilities Commission. There's an intimate relationship between narratives, and all narrative stories have a bit of a bullshit component. let's call it the BQ, right? The bullshit quotient. Some parts of a narrative are true, some are exaggerated, some are not true. It's often somehow about an agenda and what you're going to do next. And so there's a relationship between narrative and power and social groups who are maintaining that power. And in this case, the employees thought they're being mind controlled because they can't use normal words that make sense anymore, right? How are you going to advocate for yourself if the new words you're allowed to use are totally inscrutable? Right? How can you use words to think for yourself with words like that?
Incidentally, Scott Adams, the cartoonist who's the author of the Dilbert comic strips that make fun of white-collar offices, was an employee of Pacific Bell in the 1980s and 1990s, and the personalities he encountered there became the inspiration for many of his Dilbert characters. Let me elaborate on this concept of the bullshit quotient of a narrative, which I made up on the spot in lecture. We are surrounded by stories. We hear them about ourselves, other people, things, processes, the world. We tell stories about ourselves, what we did, and who we are. Many of our theories and models are stories. All of our cultures and leaders bring their particular myths with them. Some stories, some narratives, are more objectively accurate than others. That's true. Let's start with the methods section of your chemistry lab report. So after you put on your safety goggles, you put 50 mils of chemical A into a test tube with a pipette, and then you added 25 mils of chemical B before you combined them in a crucible and put it on a hot plate at 100 degrees. We left it for 60 seconds. That could be very accurate, but it's still not a totally, perfectly complete and comprehensive account. It wasn't exactly 50 mils. Maybe you didn't really wear the goggles. You didn't mention that you spilled the first batch or that you were joking around with your lab partner. And validly, you decided to leave much of that out. Maybe not the part about the safety goggles. Who needs to know? And the TA would have docked your grade for it. My point is that even if that was a very good lab report, you left something out. Then, there are those helpful heuristics that are adaptive and useful if error-prone, like your assumption that everything you read in your textbook is true, and that they haven't left anything really important out. Then there are overgeneralized facts, stereotypes, and opinions masquerading as fact. That graph about sleep and accidents, male answer syndrome, the 10,000-hour rule, and the claim that we can remember 5,000 faces. There's some basis in fact in common sense, but here we also enter into hyperbole and distortion about which we are not transparent. An advertisement about the greatness of a shampoo or a historical account of the greatness of an emperor or a nation come with more construction, and more instrumental and more political construction. Sometimes there are things that the teller of the story would rather not think about or tell you. Maybe they'll exaggerate, or suppress something, or even add parts that aren't true to impress you, to convince you. They might even tell themselves, even convince themselves, that it's true. Literally true. Maybe they have to. The academic study of bullshit began with wartime propaganda from the Second World War, and we have that today. The ghost of Kiev is an urban legend. Probably doesn't exist, even though the Ukrainian government says he does. But believing in him boosts morale in people who really need it. Putin isn't denazifying the Ukraine. Both countries have citizens who are neo-Nazis, and so does Canada, for that matter. It's merely a pretext for a war. Special military operation. So, how do you assess a narrative if it's at best only partly true? Ask how true a guide it is for your next action. Does it help you make better decisions, more adaptive decisions? Does it lead you to good places or bad ones? Like the word gaslighting, the word bullshit is a lay term that has more than one usage in currency. As the first student to answer my question, what is bullshit, in class identified, it also refers to meaninglessness. A lot of people feel like their jobs are bullshit, like they're not really accomplishing anything useful, that they're deeply inefficient, or maybe more about things like ticking boxes, pushing paper, helping someone or something maintain an image, or even somehow perpetrating harm. Academic journals take themselves very seriously. Alan Sokal is a physicist who published an academic article that was complete, meaningless nonsense. It sounded very intellectual, though. He argued that gravity is a subjective, political, social construct. He wrote, "The pi of Euclid and the g of Newton, formerly thought to be constant and universal, are now perceived in their ineluctable historicity, and the putative observer becomes fatally decentered, disconnected from any epistemic link to a space-time point." Wow, doesn't that sound smart? Well, it's not. But it did sound appropriately left-leaning for an academic audience, so the editors of the journal Social Text published it, much to Sokal's amusement. So it wasn't entirely without meaning. He was making a joke and having them on, and calling out academics for being pretentious and stringing together big words in ways that mean little, but sound very virtuous. A certain psychologist once thought it'd be funny if he could get other psychologists to say the word yumpity with a straight face. So he wrote an article proposing it for the psychological lexicon. He wrote, "The noun yumpity is offered as a potential solution for the gap in the psychological lexicon. It is suggested that having a word for ascendant anxiety, the discomforting subjective state of perfectionism, could assist in the development of parsimonious cognitive models of obsessive-compulsive disorder." Of course, that's meaningless. That's why he couldn't understand it. But when there's enough jargon, no one can tell anymore. Here's another fun fact for you. The psychology department at the Nova Scotia Health Authority is on the 4th floor of the Abbey Lane building. If you go there, you'll find a meeting room called the Buffalo Room, and it has that picture of a purple buffalo head on the sign. Buffalo is the Slovak word for bullshit, and my grandmother, who lived through plenty of propaganda, said it a lot. My father, who was once director of psychology, gave the room that name because that is where the psychologists had their bullshit meetings.
Your last Feldman and Lavoie assignment is due this week. On Sunday, you have a quiz, right? And that last adaptive learning assignment. And then on Tuesday, we'll talk about personality. And what I'll do is send you out some personality tests that you can use to take a spin. So there's different methods we use to try to understand personality. One of them might be your star sign, right? Are you a Capricorn? What does that say about you? You can look at Enneagram and the Big Five model and the MBTI, and then talk about them in class. Thank you for your attention. And I'll see you next week.